In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Meteorite Mage build. This is a level 150 Mage build that focuses on the use of gravity spells to great effect. So first up, let's talk about the two staffs that we use for this build. We have the Carrion Regal Scepter in our right hand, and we have the Meteorite Staff in our left. The reason we have this setup is because the Meteorite Staff actually gives you a 30% damage boost to Gravity Sorceries. This is Rock Sling, Collapsing Stars, Gravity Well, Meteorite, and Meteorite of Astel. So all those spells are going to get plus 30% damage if you're wielding that staff when you cast that spell. That doesn't mean you have to cast it with that staff, but you need to at least be holding that staff in your hand when you cast it. And the reason that we have it in a left hand is that we're going to be casting in the right hand with the Carrion Regal Scepter, because the Carrion Regal Scepter actually has better sorcery scaling at 80 intelligence. So we're going to get increased damage by casting it with the Carrion Regal Scepter, and we're going to get increased damage by holding the Meteorite Staff in our left hand. That 30% damage boost is higher than something like the Jellyfish Shield's damage buff that it gives you when you buff with it, which is 20%. So it makes more sense to carry that staff in this case, not only because you don't need the requirements for that shield without having to put some stats into it, but because you're going to get even more damage out of it. Beyond these two staffs, really the only other weapon that I'm using is the Frenzied Flame Seal, and the only reason I'm using that is to cast Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. We don't need to upgrade this at all. It weighs 0, which is why I picked this one. There are other seals that weigh 0 you can use, or you can use one that doesn't weigh 0 if you don't have this one. But really, you don't need to upgrade it at all because those two spells can't be increased in efficiency. So you don't really need to upgrade the seal at all. You just have it there, buff when you need it, and then swap back to the Meteorite Staff. Now, when it comes to armor for this build, you're going to have fairly light armor because we don't have hardly any points in endurance at all, if any at all. So you're going to use something really light. You can use pieces that increase your intelligence, like helmets that increase your intelligence if you wish. It's not super important. You should have plenty of stats to go around with this build. So you can do that to get a few extra points in intelligence, which you could then dump into vigor to give you more health. I only have 40 vigor with this build because we are a mage build and we're playing at range. So that would give you a little bit more vigor. Whatever you do, though, just make sure that your equipment load is light enough that you can medium roll still. When it comes to talismans for this build, I'm using the Ritual Sword Talisman, the Graven Mask Talisman, the Magic Scorpion Charm, and Godfrey Icon. Ritual Sword Talisman gives you plus 10% damage when you're at max health. Again, you're playing at range. You're probably not going to get hit too often if you're playing the build correctly. You're trying not to get hit. So this is going to increase your spell damage by 10%. And it's one of the few talismans out there that can actually increase your spell damage without having to trigger some like multiple attacks or something like that. Graven Mask Talisman simply gives you increase to sorcery damage, where all of our spells here that deal damage are sorceries. So this works out nicely. The reason we're using the Magic Scorpion Charm for this build is that Collapsing Stars and Gravity Well both deal 100% magic damage, and Meteorite and Meteorite of Astel deal some magic damage. Rock Sling is the only gravity spell that deals 100% physical damage, although Meteorite and Meteorite of Astel deal primarily physical damage. However, the Collapsing Star spell and Gravity Well are pretty much staples as you're moving throughout the levels in this game, so increasing the damage they deal is fantastic. And the reason that we're using Godfrey Icon here is that Gravity Well and Collapsing Stars can both be charged, and you're going to increase the damage of these when you do that by about 15%, which is fantastic. These, again, are two spells that you're going to use a lot with this build, because Meteorite and Meteorite of Astel are not spells that you can cast all the time, and Rock Sling isn't very good in close quarter situations. So let's talk about the spells a little bit for this build. There are 5 Gravity Sorceries in total: Collapsing Stars, Gravity Well, Meteorite, Meteorite of Astel, and Rock Sling, which I previously mentioned. Collapsing Stars and Gravity Well are pretty much going to be your bread and butter with this build as you move around the landscape, go through dungeons, face regular enemies, and there's a couple reasons for that. The damage is very high, particularly Collapsing Stars outperforms Gravity Well in terms of total damage, although it costs a little more FP. But these both deal 100% magic damage, which means they're going to get the most benefit from Magic Scorpion Charm. And they can also both be charged, so they're going to gain the benefit of Godfrey Icon as well. So when you can charge them, you should. They also work better in closer proximity to enemies, like not point blank, but in the like 5 to 10 meters, 15 meters range. They're a lot better than Rock Sling. Rock Sling, if the enemy isn't far enough away, usually 1 or 2 of the rocks will go by them, or sometimes if you're in a tight corridor, one of the rocks will hit the side of the corridor and you'll lose out on a lot of damage that way. And it can be very hard to use when you're not at range. Another thing I want to note about Collapsing Stars and Gravity Well specifically is they have a mechanic built into them that allows you to pull enemies towards you. Collapsing Stars pulls a little bit with each orb that hits the enemy, whereas Gravity Well pulls like one substantial pull, and it's better at pulling like more difficult or harder to move enemies, whereas Collapsing Stars is better at moving smaller enemies because it can hit them multiple times and that they move a lot more, whereas it may not move larger enemies in some cases. This may not sound like a great mechanic because you're a mage and you don't want enemies to get close to you, but you can use this to pull enemies off ledges, or you can use them, particularly Gravity Well, I find, to pull enemies into you, where you can use Spinning Weapon to just absolutely annihilate them with the Carrion Regal Scepter before they can do anything, because the damage that you'll do with that skill is very, very high, because that's magic damage, and you have the Magic Scorpion Charm and Ritual Sword Talisman, etc., so you'll do substantial damage with that as well. Another thing that I wanted to mention about Gravity Well and Collapsing Stars as well is that you sort of duck down when you stick your staff into the ground, which is a small thing. However, it allows you to duck under horizontal attacks, not unlike Beast Claw when you're using that spell. So if you time it right, you can actually avoid attacks. And if you watch closely during the Malekith fight, you'll actually see that this happens to me 2 times, where I'm mid-casting the spell, I thrust the staff into the ground, and his attack goes right over the top of my head when he does a horizontal slash, and this actually saves me 2 separate times. Also, if you find you liked Spinning Weapon as an ability, you can also swap out like Godfrey Icon, for instance, for something like Shard of Alexander to further boost the damage of that. You're going to be using Spinning Weapon a lot more than you think with this build, because it's the best way to handle point-blank enemies. These spells take too long to cast when you are very close to enemies, and sometimes they can go right over an enemy if they're close anyway. So Spinning Weapon is really what's going to save you in those scenarios. Rocksling is really good for this build because it's 100% physical damage, and sometimes you will face enemies that are magic resistant. It's not a commonly resisted damage type, I find, magic in this game. However, there are enemies like Renalia, etc. that are resistant to magic damage, and it's a good way to get around those resistances and deal physical damage. It's also very good at staggering enemies. If you need to stagger something, if they have a weak point like the Fire Giant or something, you can stagger them pretty easily with this spell as long as you can stay at range, and it's a great way to knock down enemies, so you can get in some free shots with spells, or you can go up and use Spinning Weapon on them if you want. So Meteorite and Meteorite of Astal are 2 spells that are very, very situational, because essentially what you want to do is just hold the button down when you're casting these spells in order to unleash just tons and tons of meteors that usually will wipe out everything on the screen, or if it's a big enemy, which is generally when I'm using it, will hit them repeatedly and hopefully wipe out their health bar before they can do anything. The Cerulean Hidden Tier works very, very well with both of these spells because it allows you to use your Flask of Wonders physique as you get into combat, and then just hold down this button for like 10 seconds where you don't consume any FP at all, and you can just rain meteors down, usually on big enemies like dragons, and just chew their health bar away. Sometimes it'll even knock them down if you hit them in their weak spot or head enough times, and then you can just cast it again and finish them off. The difference between Meteorite and Meteorite of Astal is just that Meteorite is cheaper and it doesn't shoot out as many projectiles as Meteorite of Astal does as quickly, and you can get it earlier in the game. So you're pretty much going to use Meteorite until you get Meteorite of Astal, because if you're using the Cerulean Hidden Tier, that FP cost of the spell doesn't matter anyway, and you want to get out as many meteors as you can, and Meteorite of Astal is better at doing that. Also, one of the reasons that we have a huge FP pool with this build with 40 Mind is because we want to be able to use these spells even when we don't have Cerulean Hidden Tier, or like, you know, if you've already used it once and you need to go again with your FP bar to just drain it onto an enemy. You want to be able to get good use out of this spell even when you don't have that, because you're not going to have that in every situation. You know, beyond being able to cast a lot of spells, you'll be able to use these spells effectively with huge FP pool as well. Beyond the gravity spells themselves, Golden Vow is simply there to give you another way to boost your damage and also give you a little bit more protection. You are kind of squishy with this build. And Flame Grant Me Strength is there to increase your physical damage. As I mentioned, Meteorite of Astal deal primarily physical damage, and Rocksling is 100% physical damage. So it can boost those spells. It doesn't last very long. It's a 30-second buff, so it's very, very situational, but sometimes you want to use it. And lastly, we have Terra Magica, which boosts your magic damage while you're standing in the kind of circle that it puts on the ground. This is really good for fights where you're going to be using Gravity Well or Collapsing Stars, because those deal 100% magic damage. It's not as effective with Meteorite or Meteorite of Astal, so you want to try and primarily use those spells when you're using Terra Magica. So when it comes to the stats for this build, I have 40 Vigor, 40 Mind, 11 Endurance, 12 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 80 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and 9 Arcane. So we have 40 Vigor here, which is probably a little bit lower than most people would like, particularly in light armor. But again, this is a mage build. You're trying to play at range. You're trying to stay out of melee range most of the time. So you shouldn't be getting hit, and 40 Vigor should be enough if you're playing the build correctly. 40 Mind is there again to give you a huge FP pool so you don't have to worry about casting spells. You can cast a lot of spells where you can use Meteorite or Meteorite of Astal without worry and hold it down and still get a very effective, burst damage in some cases. 11 Endurance is just there because I had an extra point, so I put it in Endurance. You could put it in Intelligence or Figure or Mind, wherever you want. Doesn't really matter. Strength and Dexterity are not really needed for this build at all. They're just there because of my class. And 80 Intelligence is there to get the most out of the Carrion Regal Staff. Again, you want to be able to do as much damage as you can with these spells, and it really shines about 80 and then starts dropping off. 25 Faith is simply there to meet the requirements for Golden Vow. I started as a Confessor, so this was only about 11 points for me to get there. But if you're another class, you may want to consider, not using this or, taking a couple points from Strength and Dexterity. If you're a different class, hopefully those can go into Faith a lot easier. Maybe you have like 9 Strength and 8 Dexterity or something. You could take those extra points and put them into Faith. Should make it fairly close, to where you need about 10 points. Shouldn't be that bad. And Arcane, again, you don't really need for this build. And just a final tip for this build, if you're using the Flask of Wonders Physique, obviously the Cerulean Hidden Tier is very, very good. If you're going to go into a boss fight and use Meteorite or Meteorite of Astal. That's not always the case, though. Some bosses are very quick and agile. You're just not going to be able to do that. Some bosses are big, and you can. But if you're not using that, using the Magic Shrouding Tier is also very good. If you're going to be using Gravity Well or Collapsing Stars, which you will in a lot of boss fights, particularly with smaller bosses. So that's a good one to use. And the Green Burst Crystal Tier, in order to increase your stamina recovery, is always good, because you do consume stamina quite regularly when you're casting spells. And getting that stamina back quickly allows you to keep casting and also continue dodging and casting at the same time. So that wraps up our Meteorite Mage build. I don't know how many more builds I'm planning on doing at the moment. I wouldn't say this is the last build, but we are considering doing a series on different weapon classes, for instance. The first one we're considering doing is Great Swords. Going through the Great Swords, showing their movesets, talking about the strengths and weaknesses of each Great Sword, and really diving into what Great Sword you should be using depending on what kind of build you're going for. A lot of people know, they like Great Swords, but maybe they're not sure which Great Sword to use. So we're considering doing a series on the different weapon classes, going through each weapon in those classes and sort of explaining what is good about those weapons and what their weaknesses are. So if that's something you guys would like to see, let us know in the comments below, because this isn't something we've officially decided yet, but I would really like to know if that's something you guys would be interested in. So let us know in the comments below.